Welcome! In this series of short videos, we will look at topics for the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today, we will look at the use of DynamicForms within your application. With the PowerBasic Windows compiler, all the forms we have shown so far have been quite static, in that the number of objects on the form stays the same for the duration of the form on the screen. What we're going to do today is something a bit more dynamic. What we have on screen at the moment is a simple static form with 6 labels and 6 text boxes and an exit button. When this form is displayed to the user, all the objects on the form will be displayed at that point in time. What we're going to do is we're going to make some of these fields invisible to the user. If we have a look at the form itself in code, we can see here all the labels and the text boxes are defined within the code. If we go into the event handler of the form, the callback function, we'll find there is a section at the top called Initialize Dialog. What we're going to do in here is we're going to put some code in here to make some of these text boxes and labels invisible. This can be quite easily done in a for next loop. So we'll create a local variable to be used in our for next loop. And in here we're going to use a control hide command to actually hide our label controls and our text boxes. Now the control hide command would expect in here a number of variables. The first variable being the handle of the form, which we can get using the cbhdl command. It would next expect to be given the unique identifier of the object we wish to hide. Now if we look right at the beginning of our code where all the objects have been defined, we'll see the example our labels start at 1002 and the text boxes start at 1008. So what I'm going to do is to set up a couple of extra constants that we can use. We have a label start constant which is equal to the first label and the text box start constant which is going to be equal to the first text box number. So in our control hide command we can use the long R as being a counter, and we're going to add to that the constant we created for the label start. So it's going to hide the first one after the label start command. So if we run this code as it stands now, we should hide a number of the labels. So we'll see on our form only the first label is now showing. All the other fields are actually hidden. So we'll do the same for the text boxes. Now we can use much the same command. We're going to use the prefix command to save a bit of typing here. All the prefix command does is it takes what's in quotes after it, and at compile time it adds the string to this and then compiles the whole line. So we can quite happily add in the constant we created for the text box start. And if we run this now, we'll see that the only fields on the screen are the first label and the first text box. All the rest are hidden and cannot be clicked on. So we have dynamically removed some of the fields from the user's perspective. What we want to do now is to make this quite dynamic so that the fields can appear and disappear depending on what the user actually does. In some scenarios this will happen when you're reading data from a database or from a text file or from some other action the user has actually initiated. So what we want to do on this form is we want to add an action button which the user can click on to add or remove objects from the screen. So if we nip back into our PowerBasic Forms Designer, we will see all our fields on the screen. Now we're going to add an image button onto the screen, and we'll move this up here. And in our image button we're going to put an icon. Quick double click on it and we'll browse to the icon we're going to be using, and we will add it to the object. So we now have an image button, and we're going to put code behind this image button to add and remove fields from the screen as the user presses on the button. So we'll just save that now and we'll reload. Now in our event handler we will see that there is now a task put in for the clicking of that button, and the code we're going to put in here is what's going to make the fields appear or disappear. So we're going to use some static variables at the top of our event handler. one to keep track of the number of objects on screen, and one to keep track of the increment, whether we're adding or subtracting objects from the screen. And we will set those initially at being 1 in our initialization handler. So from the user's perspective, there will be one set of objects on screen, one label, one text box, and we will be incrementing, we'll be adding objects to the screen. When it becomes time to remove objects, this value stored in a long increment will become -1. So when the button has been pressed, we need to put some code in to handle that. So we're going to do a select case statement in here to test how many objects are actually on the screen at the moment. So we'll handle the scenario when there's between 1 and 5 objects on the screen. When there are between 1 and 5 objects, then we can actually add more objects to the screen because they are currently invisible and we want to make them visible again. So we'll need to test to see whether we're adding or removing, and at the moment we will be adding. So we're testing the value of the long increment value, and if it's 1, we must be adding to the screen. We'll cover the removal of objects later on. So in order to make the object visible, we need to use the control normalize command, which effectively re-shows the object on the screen. So we're going to use the same technique as we used before. We use the prefix command to save a wee bit of typing, and we're going to use the control normalize with the handle for the form and the long object count, which at the moment we know is 1, plus the constant for the beginning of the labels, and the same for the text boxes. And once we've done that, we'll want to increase the number of objects on the screen by 1, and we'll do that in here. So if we try running this now and we press the plus button, we will see that new objects get added to the screen each time we press the button, and once we get to 6 it will stop adding. Now what I'd like to do is, once it gets to the 6th object appearing on screen, I'd like the icon on this button to change to a minus, and then to start removing objects on the screen back till we're back to 1 set of labels and text boxes. So how will we do that? Well, we need to test to see when we've actually got to the last object. So here, where we add on to the object count, if we're on the 5th object and we increment this number, we will then be on this 6th object. And at that point, we want to change the icon that's sitting on that button to the minus icon. So we'll just do a quick test on the object count to see if it's 6. If that's the case, we know we've reached the last of the objects. So there are two things we need to do. We need to change the value of the increment to -1, because from here on the user will be removing objects from the screen. And then we want to change the image on that button. Now there's a command called control set image button, which can be used to quite easily change the value. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the control set image button with a number of parameters. First being the handle of the form, the second being the handle of the object, i.e. the button, and the third to tell it which image file to use. Now at the moment, if we look at the image files we've actually got set up in the system, we have a image button 1. Now we don't have an image button 2 yet, we'll need to set that one up. The easiest way to do this is if we have a look in the resource file. The resource file is used by the forms designer for a number of purposes. Now we can see in this resource file there are 2 references to image file 1. One being the number and the second one being the icon. So we're going to create a new one for the minus icon. And we're going to call that image file 2. And we will give that a value up here, and we'll make that 103. Now once you've made changes to a resource file, you have to effectively compile it, which creates the PBR file. So if we hit compile on that, it has successfully created the res file and the PBR file. So if we hit OK, we're finished in here. We go back to here. There are our two image files, 102 and 103. And right at the top is the PBR file we have just compiled. So now we've got that set up, this piece of code should actually work. So let's just close off the select statement. So what should happen when we reach the 6th object is that the icon on the button should change. So let's try that. So we can quite happily add objects up until the 6th button, and on the 6th button the icon has now changed to a minus. Now we'll have to put some additional code in so that when we click on this button now, it will start to remove these objects. So we're handling cases 1 to 5, we now have to handle case 6. So we've now reached the last object. So now we should be starting to remove objects from the screen. So again, we need to use the control hide command to hide both of the objects from the user. So there's our prefix command again, control hide, the handle to the form, and the pointer to which object we're talking about. So we're using label start plus the object count, which will be 6, minus 1. And after that, we will then change the number of objects on screen by adding on, in this case, what is now a minus number, to that. Now we'll also have to handle what happens when we get back to the first object again, because when we get back to the first object, we'll be wanting to add them again. So in this select statement, we'll need a case 1. So when it gets back to the first object, we know we've reached the first object, therefore we need to start incrementing again. So we will reset our long increment variable to 1, and we can then change the icon on that button back to the plus again, exactly as we did it before. So let's try that now. So there's our form with a single label and text box. Each time we click the image button, we're adding an extra set of fields up until we get to number 6, and it's now gone to the minus. And when we start pressing the button now, it has removed the 6th one, but it hasn't done the rest. So there's something we've missed in the logic. Up here where we're handling cases 1 to 5, there was an else statement, and we'll need to populate that. So if the object count is actually greater than 1, we must be removing. Because this section handles incrementing adding objects, and this section should be for the removing of objects. So again, we want in here the control hide statement again. And this was the logic we were missing. So let's try that again now. So we can add boxes quite happily up until we get to number 6. The icon is now dynamically changed to a minus, and we can now remove until we get back to the first one. And when we're back in the first one, the icon on the button is changed back to the plus, and we can go ahead and add them again. So you can see from this, there's quite a lot you can do to allow the user to dynamically control what appears on the screen. So an action initiated by a user can actually redraw parts of the screen quite dynamically. But that's it for today. Thank you for watching.